Get ready to dive into a raw and revealing look at what it truly meant to travel across the Old West in a covered wagon. We're talking about a journey unlike any road trip today, where extreme weather, dangerous river crossings, and lurking outlaws posed real threats around every bend. If you've ever wondered how people survived this grueling trek, or what day-to-day life felt like on those dusty trails, stick around. We're about to explore brutal realities that made these journeys a test of sheer willpower and determination. Number 10. The trail's legacy. The driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory, Utah in 1869, completing the first transcontinental railroad, signaled a major shift in westward migration. The era of the great overland trails was coming to a close, but the Oregon Trail itself had been evolving for decades. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought a flood of 49ers, transforming the trail and its surrounding communities. The 1850s saw an increased military presence along the route, along with physical improvements like ferries and bridges. Steamboats began plying the Columbia River, offering an alternative to wagon travel for part of the journey. The 1860s brought even more changes. Settlements grew larger and more numerous. Communication improved with the Pony Express and then the Transcontinental Telegraph. Stagecoach lines expanded, offering faster travel options. And after the Civil War, conflicts with Native Americans intensified in many areas. The Oregon Trail, once a remote and challenging path, was becoming increasingly integrated into a rapidly changing nation. The railroad may have marked the end of an era, but the Oregon Trail had already undergone a significant transformation. The new technologies of communication and transportation often followed the established routes of the Oregon Trail. Telegraph lines were strung alongside the trail, and railroad tracks were sometimes laid directly over its path. While the railroad didn't immediately eliminate wagon travel, it dramatically reduced the need for it. Of all the westward trails, the Oregon Trail remained in use the longest, partly because the railroad didn't reach Oregon until the early 1880s. Even after the railroads replaced most wagon train traffic, the Oregon Trail continued to serve a purpose. It became a major route for driving cattle and sheep eastward to market. The trail, once a path of westward expansion, now facilitated a different kind of movement, connecting the developing West with the established markets of the East. The Oregon Trail, though no longer a primary route for westward migration, continued to play a role in the evolving American economy. The Oregon Trail, as a continuous, traversable route, no longer exists, but its legacy remains. Traces of the trail are still visible today, offering glimpses into this important chapter of American history. In many places, you can still see the ruts carved into the ground by thousands of wagons. Near Guernsey, Wyoming, these ruts are particularly striking, worn as deep as 5 feet into the sandstone. Imagine the countless wagons that passed through this very spot, carrying hopeful pioneers westward. Names and dates carved into soft sandstone formations like Independence Rock still bear witness to the passage of these travelers. These inscriptions, made over a century ago, offer a personal connection to the pioneers who made this arduous journey. Many landmarks along the trail are now protected areas. Scotts Bluff National Monument and Chimney Rock National Historic Site preserve iconic formations that guided and inspired generations of pioneers. Historic forts like Forts Bridger, Kearney, Laramie, and Vancouver, along with sites like the Whitman Mission, offer further insights into life on the trail. These preserved sites allow us to connect with the past, offering a tangible link to the pioneers who forged a path westward, shaping the nation we know today. Recognizing the importance of the Oregon Trail, the U.S. Congress established the Oregon National Historic Trail in 1978. The goal was to preserve and protect the trail's remnants and provide public access where possible. The National Park Service oversees the trail, working in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies. Several interpretive centers along the route offer visitors a deeper understanding of the trail's history and significance. The Oregon Trail is also connected to other National Park Service sites, including Homestead National Monument of America in Nebraska, Fossil Butte National Monument in Wyoming, and Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, and Hagerman Fossil Beds National Monument in Idaho. The trail even passes through sections of several national forests. These sites offer a broader perspective on the westward expansion, exploring themes of settlement, natural history, and the challenges faced by pioneers. By preserving and interpreting these sites, we gain a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices and triumphs of those who traveled the Oregon Trail, shaping the American West and the nation as a whole. The Oregon Trail hasn't just left its mark on the landscape, it's also become part of popular culture. Several movies have depicted the trail and the challenges faced by pioneers. In 1977, there was even a short-lived television series called The Oregon Trail. But perhaps the most famous portrayal of the Oregon Trail is the educational computer game. Hugely popular in the 1980s and 90s, the game introduced generations of students to the hardships and adventures of westward migration. And it's not just a relic of the past. The Oregon Trail game has been re-released in various digital formats, ensuring that new generations can experience this interactive journey into history. From movies to television to video games, the Oregon Trail continues to capture our imagination, reminding us of the pioneers who braved the unknown to forge a new life in the West. Number 9. Hazards of the journey. Just how dangerous was the Oregon Trail? It's tough to say for sure. Like the total number of immigrants, death tolls are hard to pin down precisely. Estimates vary quite a bit. Some historians place the mortality rate at around 4 to 6% of all travelers. That translates to somewhere between 12,000 and 24,000 deaths. Other estimates go as high as 10%. What were the biggest dangers? Accidents and disease. Pioneer diaries frequently mention accidental shootings, injuries from encounters with animals, drownings, and deaths from exposure to the cold. Wagon accidents were also common, and tragically, children were sometimes seriously injured after falling under the wheels of a moving wagon. Life on the trail was precarious. Death was a constant companion, a stark reminder of the risks pioneers faced on their journey west. Disease was a constant threat on the Oregon Trail. Sanitation was a major challenge. Opportunities to bathe or wash clothes were rare, and clean drinking water was often scarce. Human and animal waste, along with garbage and dead animals, often contaminated water sources. Cholera, a waterborne disease, was the biggest killer overall. Diphtheria, another highly contagious illness, was the leading cause of death among children. Weakened by exhaustion and poor nutrition, pioneers were also vulnerable to typhoid, mountain fever, likely a tick-borne illness, dysentery, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, food poisoning, scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency, and alkali poisoning from drinking contaminated water. Measles, mumps, and smallpox also took their toll, especially on children. Childbirth also posed serious risks to women on the trail. The lack of proper medical care meant that even minor illnesses could quickly become life-threatening. Disease was a constant fear, and its presence cast a long shadow over the westward journey. We often see movies depicting circled wagons under attack by Native Americans, but in reality, conflict with Native Americans was relatively rare during the peak years of the Oregon Trail. Historian John Unruh's research suggests that fewer than 400 immigrants were killed in Native American attacks between 1840 and 1860. More often than not, interactions between pioneers and Native Americans were peaceful, even helpful. Native Americans often traded supplies with the pioneers, operated ferries, or assisted with managing livestock. While wagon trains did often circle their wagons at night, this was primarily to corral their animals, not to defend against attacks. In the rare instances when attacks did occur, wagons were typically in a line of travel, not a defensive circle. The Hollywood image of constant conflict doesn't reflect the more nuanced reality of life on the Oregon Trail. Sadly, many of the conflicts that did occur between pioneers and Native Americans were sparked by the pioneers themselves. Cultural misunderstandings, arrogance, and acts of violence against Native Americans, such as shootings, sometimes provoked retaliation. And often, this retaliation wasn't directed at the specific group responsible, but at the next wagon train that came along. After the 1850s, the tax on smaller wagon trains or individual travelers did increase. This rise in violence reflected growing Native American hostility towards white settlers who were increasingly encroaching on their lands. The relationship between pioneers and Native Americans was complex and often fraught with tension, and the increasing pressure of westward expansion exacerbated these tensions. The end of the Oregon Trail wasn't always a happy ending. Many pioneers arrived in dire straits. Some had run out of food and were starving. Others were sick and exhausted. Many were destitute, having lost their wagons, their belongings, or spent their last dollars on tolls. Fortunately, established Oregon residents often organized relief efforts. Charitable settlers would form pack trains and meet the new arrivals at the Dalles, providing much-needed supplies and assistance for the final leg of their journey. This aid was often the difference between life and death for those who had endured so much to reach their destination. While the journey west was full of hardship, it also revealed the compassion and generosity of those who had already made the arduous trek. Number 8. Unpredictable river crossings. No matter how carefully people planned, river crossings could become nightmarish ordeals. The current might be stronger than expected, or the river could be deeper than it looked from the banks. Sometimes a wagon train would wait days hoping the water level would drop, draining precious time and supplies in the process. If they decided to attempt crossing, they had to float the wagon or ford the river at a shallow point. Flotation meant sealing wagon beds with pitch or tar to make them semi-waterproof, then guiding the animals to swim or walk alongside. One slip could lead to disaster, with supplies and personal belongings lost downstream. Occasionally, entire wagons were swept away. The potential for tragedy was huge, and diaries are filled with accounts of animals drowning or panicking, causing the wagon to overturn. Even if the crossing went relatively smoothly, everything got soaked, including clothes, blankets, and food. Damp conditions in the wagon could breed mold, and fresh water damage often ruined flour or sugar. Lawmen stationed near busy river fords sometimes offered help or tried to organize a ferry system. But those ferries could be expensive, and not everyone could afford the fees. Outlaws also loitered near river crossings, aware that travelers were vulnerable when their focus was on keeping wagons and supplies safe. This forced pioneers to split their attention between the logistics of crossing and the threat of thieves. In some cases, local entrepreneurs set up makeshift bridges or rope lines for a fee, but those structures weren't always reliable. The ropes could snap, or the bridges might collapse under the weight of a heavily loaded wagon. People made do as best they could, often using trial and error to figure out the safest spot to cross. Settlers who made multiple trips sometimes scouted for better crossing points, but the water patterns changed with the seasons. Modern analyses of these routes showed the distances covered were immense, often 1,000 miles or more, so it's no surprise that any major river presented a daunting challenge. Surviving one crossing didn't mean the journey was guaranteed to be easier. Another major river could appear 100 miles down the road, and with each crossing, the group had to muster the same level of caution and cooperation. This final difficulty, like the others, highlighted just how brutal traveling the Old West in a covered wagon could be for anyone dreaming of a fresh start on unfamiliar land. Number 7. Physical and emotional toll. Traveling in a covered wagon wasn't just about dealing with external dangers, it was also a personal endurance test. Waking up before dawn to feed and harness the animals, then walking or riding for hours in rough terrain was punishing on the body. People developed blisters, sore muscles, and other aches from simply trying to keep pace. Children were often restless or terrified, and parents had to manage crying babies while also staying alert to the wagon's condition. Insomnia was common because nights could be interrupted by the howls of coyotes, the threat of bandits, or harsh weather. Emotional strain weighed heavily, particularly on women, who were responsible for cooking meals in primitive conditions and caring for sick relatives while the wagon bumped along. If tragedy struck, be it from disease, a broken limb, or an accident, there was little chance to properly grieve. The group needed to press forward, so heartbreak and trauma often went unaddressed. Meanwhile, single travelers such as prospectors or ranchers hoping to start a new life faced a different kind of loneliness. They had no extended support system, which made the relentless days and nights even more challenging. Some turned to alcohol for solace, though booze wasn't always easy to get. Others wrote in journals or tried to keep spirits up by singing songs around the campfire. But the demands of the road rarely let people relax for long. Stories from this period talk about nightmares of stampeding animals or wagons and tipping over in swift rivers. Nearly everyone on the trail experienced some brush with disaster, and after surviving the crossing, many found they had changed drastically, having become tougher or more cynical about life. Frontier life demanded adaptability, and those who couldn't cope sometimes turned back. The psychological impact of these journeys was immense, but it's a topic that often gets overshadowed by the romance of the Wild West. Modern studies in social history have begun to highlight how these migrants were not just physically tested, but emotionally tested as well. Having to look out for Old West outlaws, unpredictable weather, and limited resources wore people down day after day. The Old West dream, fueled by tales of fertile land and new opportunities, came at a steep personal cost for many. Number 6. Tense relations with Native Americans. The Old West was home to numerous Native American nations, each with its own cultures, traditions, and territories. As wagon trains cut across these lands, misunderstandings and conflicts were common. Some tribes viewed the encroaching settlers as a threat to their hunting grounds, water sources, or sacred areas. In other instances, groups of Native Americans might approach a wagon train to trade buffalo robes or moccasins for items like coffee, sugar, or metal tools. However, if communication broke down due to language barriers or distrust built up from previous negative encounters, tensions could escalate quickly. Historians studying American Old West facts note that actual raids on covered wagons by Native Americans were less frequent than folklore suggests, but the fear of possible attacks was persistent. On the flip side, unscrupulous wagon train members sometimes stole horses or killed game on lands claimed by local tribes, fueling resentment. Different treaties and agreements were attempted by the United States government, but on the ground, many settlers pushed forward without respecting those boundaries. Some travelers wrote in diaries about traveling in constant anxiety, especially through areas with a history of confrontations. Others recounted peaceful interactions where Native American guides helped the wagon trains navigate tough terrain, find water sources, or avoid areas prone to flooding. The nuance often got lost in sensational stories circulated in Eastern newspapers, which portrayed the frontier as a battlefield. Yet it's important to remember that relations varied widely depending on the people involved. While some tribes might charge a toll or demand gifts for safe passage, others offered hospitality or simply observed from a distance. Modern historians analyzing accounts from Old West history documentaries emphasize that the true picture was far more complex than the simplistic image of cowboys versus Native Americans. But for families in covered wagons, the uncertainty was stressful. They never knew if the next band of Native Americans they encountered would be friendly traders or a group that felt deeply threatened by the constant wave of settlers. Either way, these interactions shaped the experiences of countless wagon trains crossing the continent. Number 5. Supply struggles. Packing a covered wagon wasn't as simple as tossing in everything a family owned. Weight was a huge factor because the wagon had to be pulled by oxen, mules, or horses, none of which could manage excessive loads over long distances. Families usually packed only the essentials, food staples like bacon, salt pork, flour, coffee, beans, rice, and maybe some dried fruits. Tools, spare parts for the wagon, and basic cooking utensils took up additional space. If travelers ran out of something critical, they had to hope they'd meet a trading post or pass near a ford. But in vast stretches of the trail, there was no such luck. When supplies ran low, hunting became a necessity, though not everyone was skilled with a rifle or had the time to leave the wagon train for an extended hunt. Even those who could hunt sometimes found the local game scarce. Buffalo herds were still a common sight in the early to mid-1800s, but overhunting and other factors started reducing their numbers in certain regions, making them less reliable as a food source. And not all travelers liked the taste of wild game, though many had no choice. Another issue was water. Finding clean drinking water could be a nightmare, especially in arid parts of the Old West. Some wells were established along major trails, but they could go dry during droughts, leaving migrants to scour riverbeds or risk drinking from stagnant ponds. Contemporary newspaper advertisements from that era often warned travelers to stock up before leaving settled areas. But once on the road, people realized that no amount of advice could fully prepare them for the challenges of supply management. They might have to abandon heavy furniture and belongings to lighten the load if animals became too fatigued or if the wagon broke down. These sacrifices could be heartbreaking, as families parted with heirlooms or cherished keepsakes. For those who managed to reach the outskirts of a new settlement or a town guarded by local lawmen, the first priority was often to secure fresh provisions. According to Old West history, some opportunistic merchants sold goods at exorbitant prices, knowing desperate travelers would pay almost anything. This uneven availability of supplies caused real tension among wagon train members, and there were even reports of theft within groups if someone got desperate enough. Number 4. Disease and poor sanitation. Beyond the obvious physical challenges, disease was an even more insidious threat. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, and other illnesses could sweep through a wagon train faster than anyone could react. Dirty water sources were a major culprit, especially if upstream travelers or animals contaminated a river or creek. Hygiene methods were limited. Pioneers might rinse their hands in a shared bucket of water, or sometimes not at all if supplies were too scarce. People often had little understanding of germs, so they'd casually dump waste in areas too close to the camp or even the wagon itself. Flies and other insects thrived in these conditions, spreading infection from one person to another. Once disease set in, finding a trained doctor was almost impossible. The typical frontier doctor might be days away, stationed in some small settlement, or might not exist at all if the region was too remote. That left sick pioneers to rely on home remedies or advice from older relatives. Some diaries mention using herbal brews or poultices made from local plants, which occasionally helped, but more often did little to halt a serious infection. People on the wagon train had to keep moving, which meant that the ill traveled in cramped, jostling wagons with minimal rest. If someone died, a quick burial along the trail was often the only option, and the wagon train had to continue onward. Modern researchers comparing historical accounts note that cholera outbreaks were notorious during certain seasons, especially near major rivers like the Platte. In some horrific cases, entire families perished before reaching their destination, and the survivors had no real way of preventing the disease from spreading. This reality meant that each night travelers worried not just about outlaws or storms, but also about the possibility of waking up to find more people sick or worse. That looming dread could wear down morale, making the journey an emotional ordeal. Despite occasional visits from traveling preachers or philanthropic doctors who tried to give basic medical tips, the truth is that poor sanitation remained a core problem on the dusty trails of the American Old West. Number 3. Threat of outlaws. We tend to romanticize outlaws and lawmen in movies, but on the frontier, bandits posed a genuine menace. Old West outlaws didn't always operate alone. In some areas, entire gangs watched the trails for wagon trains that seemed unguarded or vulnerable. They might wait until the group was stuck in a ravine or forced to stop at a water source, and then launch a raid to seize valuables or animals. Families trying to eke out a new life carried all their belongings in these wagons, including tools, precious heirlooms, and essential supplies like flour, cornmeal, and salted meat. The sudden loss of those items could doom a journey. Many diaries contain accounts of forced robberies where outlaws demanded food or any money the pioneers had left. Although some wagon trains hired private guards or allied with lawmen when they were passing near towns, protection was rarely guaranteed in the open wilderness. Gunfights did happen, but most families weren't trained in firearms. According to Old West history documentaries, travelers often tried negotiating with robbers, hoping to keep violence to a minimum and protect children. The presence of local lawmen varied from region to region. Sometimes a single lawman in a remote settlement was overwhelmed and couldn't provide adequate protection for passing wagon trains. That's why some experienced pioneers stressed traveling in larger groups. Safety in numbers was a key strategy, since a gang of outlaws was less likely to mess with a big caravan than a lone family. Yet, even big wagon trains weren't completely safe. In places like the notorious Robbers' Roost in what's now Utah or in certain parts of Arizona, outlaws operated for years with little interference from authorities, making entire stretches of the trail a high-risk gamble. Some outlaws were just desperate men who had run out of options in the harsh environment, while others were hardened criminals who saw wagon trains as easy targets. This constant fear of being attacked added another layer of stress to an already difficult journey. Number 2. Extreme weather. The Old West is often portrayed in movies as a land of blazing suns and endless dusty plains. But the reality is that travelers could face scorching heat one day and chilly nights the next, sometimes within a single 24-hour span. During the hot season, wagon travelers risked dehydration, sunstroke, and heat exhaustion, especially when crossing deserts like the Mojave or the stretches of scrubland in modern-day Utah. People didn't have reliable refrigeration or any effective way to stay cool, so they relied on canvas covers to create a bit of shade inside the wagons. This did little to stop the interior from turning into an oven if temperatures soared over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If the group was lucky enough to find a creek or river, they'd often stop just to let everyone soak their clothes and rinse off the dirt. But not every stream was safe or easy to reach. On top of that, violent thunderstorms could sweep in without warning, turning dusty trails into slick mud pits. Heavy rains also risked damaging precious supplies, so people scrambled to cover everything with tarps or water-resistant materials, which were often in short supply. And then there was the threat of early snowfall in higher elevations, like parts of the Rockies. Getting stuck in a sudden blizzard could be deadly, especially if travelers weren't equipped with warm clothing and enough provisions. Diaries from wagon trains describe situations where families barely survived freezing nights by huddling together under thick blankets, while the howling wind threatened to tear the canvas right off the wagon frame. Lightning strikes were another worry because a bolt hitting a wagon could ignite the canvas or spook the animals into a stampede. Given these conditions, it's no wonder that many migrants dreaded crossing certain parts of the country where the weather was known to shift from one extreme to another in just a matter of hours. Even for the rugged lawmen and cowboys used to the Wild West environment, these changes could be brutal. Sometimes travelers tried waiting out severe storms by setting up temporary camps, but that came with risks too, since staying put too long could drain supplies and invite attention from old Western outlaws who might view stranded wagons as easy targets. Modern-day historians studying climate data emphasize how unpredictable the weather patterns could be in the mid-1800s, making each step westward a gamble. Number 1. Brutal roads. Covered wagons had to crawl over uneven ground that was full of rocks, deep ruts, and all kinds of hazards lurking beneath layers of dust. Back in the 19th century, most travelers moving westward were following routes like the Oregon Trail or the California Trail, and those paths were not exactly smooth highways. People often relied on guesses made by earlier wagon trains that had cut vague tracks in the soil, and if the wagon wheels got caught in huge depressions or tangled in stray roots, it could mean hours or even days of delay. Reports from diaries and letters mention how settlers had to constantly hop out of the wagons to move boulders, chop down fallen logs, and fill in craters so their draft animals could keep going. These roads became even more difficult to manage if heavy rains washed them out, creating streams of thick mud. In drier conditions, dust storms could roll in and blind everyone on the journey, including the oxen or mules pulling the wagons. Historians who study the American Old West say these road conditions put immense strain on the animals. A single broken axle or lost wheel could leave a family stuck for days. This made it easy prey for Old West outlaws and other opportunists who might be lurking nearby. Some accounts describe how people put smaller children in the back of the wagon to keep them from falling off in the constant lurching, but that didn't always help. Kids still risked injuries from sudden jolts, and parents dealt with bruises and broken bones just from the bumpy ride. The everyday cowboy or frontiersman might have been a master horse rider, but guiding a big, heavy wagon through rough trails demanded a whole different skill set. The terrain often crossed deserts that seemed to stretch on forever under a scorching sun. In other places, it was dense forest or steep slopes that tested even the toughest travelers. And in every rocky canyon or narrow pass, there was the possibility of an ambush from an outlaw or a desperate band of horse thieves. The tension ran high each time the wagon train ventured into unfamiliar territory. Modern researchers who've reenacted these trails with historical wagons report that the ride can be physically exhausting even today, on ground that's been somewhat smoothed over by time. This gives an idea of how harsh roads would have felt to those early settlers who had no choice but to keep going if they wanted to find a new life in the Old West.